You are standing at the edge of Rome's Forum Boreum in the scorching heat of a summer afternoon, 66 AD. The air reeks of sweat, olive oil, and human desperation. Before you, on a raised wooden platform, stands a boy no older than 12. His skin has been oiled until it gleams in the Mediterranean sun. Around his neck hangs a placard declaring his virtues in crisp Latin: Pur formosus, docilis, intactus beautiful boy, obedient, untouched. The auctioneer's voice rises above the crowd, extolling the child's Bithynian origins, his delicate features, his potential. But this is no ordinary slave auction. This is the Venalitium, where children are purchased not for labor, but for pleasure, where beauty becomes a death sentence disguised as a privilege. Before we descend into this forgotten world of exploitation and survival, I'd love to hear from you. If you're finding value in these historical deep dives, please hit that like button and subscribe. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It fascinates me that we can be scattered across continents yet connected through our shared curiosity about the darkest corners of the past. The boy on the platform will sell for 6,000 denarii, more than 10 times the price of a field laborer, enough to feed a Roman family for 3 years. His purchaser, a rotund senator named Marcus Lucullus, will take him to his villa on the Palatine Hill, dress him in silk tunics, train him in music and poetry, and call him Pur delicatus, his exquisite boy. The child will live in golden chains, his childhood traded for the obscene privilege of proximity to power. This is the hidden architecture of Roman pleasure, a system so normalized it required no justification, so pervasive it appears in the writings of Suetonius and Cassius Dio as mere footnotes to imperial excess. Welcome to the secret lives of Rome's boy concubines, where luxury was built on the systematic destruction of innocence, and where the marble grandeur of empire rested on the broken bodies of children who had no names, no choices, and no escape. To understand the scale of what transpired within Rome's imperial palaces and aristocratic villas, we must first comprehend the legal and social framework that made such exploitation not merely possible, but respectable. The Roman Empire, at its height under emperors like Hadrian and Nero, operated under a sexual hierarchy so rigid it was encoded in law. The Lex Scantinia, passed in the late Republic, theoretically prohibited the sexual abuse of freeborn Roman boys, but it said nothing about slaves. This legal silence created a vast underclass of children whose bodies existed outside the protection of Roman jurisprudence, property that could be used and discarded at their owner's pleasure. The terminology itself reveals the system's sophistication. A pur delicatus was a prepubescent slave boy selected specifically for his beauty, kept and displayed as a status symbol. An exolitus was the older version, a young man who had aged past childhood but remained in service as a concubine. A concubinus was a male sexual slave of any age, while spintria referred specifically to those trained in particular sexual acts. These weren't crude categories of abuse, they were refined classifications in a luxury market as organized as any other Roman industry. The slave markets of Rome, particularly those clustered around the Forum Boreum and the docks along the Tiber, processed thousands of children annually. They arrived from conquered territories: Bithynia in Asia Minor, Syria, Cappadocia, Gaul, Britannia. Some were war captives. Others were sold by impoverished parents who saw no alternative to starvation. Still others were born into slavery, the children of enslaved women whose bodies produced not just labor but future merchandise. The Mangones, professional slave dealers, understood market dynamics with disturbing precision. They knew that a boy between 10 and 14, before the physical changes of adolescence, commanded premium prices. They knew that certain ethnic features, the dark curls of Syrian boys, the fair skin of Germanic children, fetched higher sums from particular buyers. They knew that training a child in music, dance, or poetry could triple his value. Contemporary sources place the average price for a skilled adult slave at 500 to 1,000 denarii. A pure delicatus, by contrast, could sell for 2,000 to 6,000 denarii or more. This wasn't merely commerce, it was investment. Wealthy Romans purchased these children not as labor, but as living ornaments, proof of refinement and power. In the imperial household, the most beautiful boys might serve at banquets, their youth and vulnerability on display for guests as surely as the silver platters they carried. They could not look away. The system demanded their visibility, even as it erased their humanity. Provincial governors maintained purchasing networks throughout the empire. Imperial agents had first access to the most desirable children, selecting them for the emperor's household before they reached public auction. Private collectors competed for the remainder. The wealthiest Romans might own dozens of such children, rotating them through their urban and rural properties like any other luxury good. Yet unlike wine or marble, these possessions aged, and in aging they lost their value. A boy who reached 16 or 17, his voice deepening and his face losing its childish softness, became expendable. Some owners freed such slaves, granting manumission as a reward for years of service. Others sold them to lower-tier buyers. Still others simply discarded them, turning them out onto Rome's streets to survive however they could. The system consumed them and moved on, an engine of exploitation that never stopped, never paused, never questioned its own brutality. The life of a pure delicatus followed patterns as rigid as any Roman military drill. For a boy purchased by a senator or wealthy equestrian, the day began before dawn in the slave quarters, not the rough barracks where field slaves slept, but separate chambers designed to preserve the merchandise. Appearance was everything. The child would be bathed, his skin rubbed with oils scented with myrrh or cinnamon, his hair arranged in the Greek style that Roman aristocrats found appealing. If his owner preferred, makeup would be applied rouge on his cheeks, kohl around his eyes. The transformation from child to ornament was complete before the household stirred. Training began early and never truly ended. These boys learned to walk with a particular gait, neither masculine stride nor feminine sway, but something carefully calibrated to please. They studied music, often specializing in the lyre or flute. They memorized poetry Catullus, Ovid, Homer in the original Greek. They learned to pour wine at the precise angle that prevented spillage, to arrange food on plates with aesthetic precision, to stand motionless for hours during banquets while their owner's guests debated philosophy and politics. Every gesture was choreographed. Every word was monitored. Spontaneity was punished. The sexual exploitation was systematic but rarely discussed openly in polite company, though it saturated every aspect of these children's existence. Roman law granted slave owners absolute authority over their human property, a principle called dominica potestas. A master could do anything to his slaves that did not permanently disable them for work. For a pure delicatus, whose work was to be beautiful and compliant, this legal framework meant total vulnerability. There were no boundaries, no appeals, no protection. Some owners were relatively restrained, content to display their beautiful slaves at social functions. Others were not. The most detailed contemporary accounts come from sources like Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars and Cassius Dio's Roman History, texts written by aristocrats for aristocratic audiences. They describe these practices with a mixture of prurient interest and moral condemnation, but always directed at excess, never at the system itself. A Roman man was expected to exercise self-control, but his slaves, including child slaves, existed outside the moral framework that governed relations between citizens. To abuse a freeborn child was unthinkable, a crime that could destroy a career. To abuse one's own slave was barely worth mentioning, unremarkable as eating breakfast. Consider the case of Martial, the satirical poet who wrote extensively about Roman life in the late 1st century A.D. His epigrams reference pueri delicati casually, treating them as familiar features of the social landscape. In one poem, he mocks a man for being too attached to his beautiful slave boy, In another, he jokes about the premium prices such children command. The tone is humorous, cynical, utterly devoid of moral outrage. This was normalization at its most complete, not the active defense of cruelty, but its absorption into the texture of daily life until it became invisible. The boys themselves left almost no written record. Literacy was common among educated slaves, but their words did not survive. We know they existed not from their own testimony, but from the testimonies of those who owned them, displayed them, and ultimately erased them. They could not look away from their own exploitation because they lived it every moment. But history looked away from them, and in that looking away, consigned them to silence. If the anonymous thousands of boy slaves constitute the hidden architecture of Roman sexual exploitation, then Sporus represents its most visible and grotesque extreme. His story, preserved in multiple ancient sources, illuminates what happened when imperial power combined with unchecked desire and the absolute objectification of human beings. In 65 A.D., the Emperor Nero's wife, Poppaea Sabina, died possibly in childbirth, though the historian Suetonius claims Nero kicked her to death during a quarrel. Devastated, or guilt-ridden, or perhaps both, Nero descended into a spiral of increasingly erratic behavior. Then he encountered Sporus. Sporus was likely already part of the imperial household, possibly a pure delicatus inherited from previous administration or recently purchased. Ancient sources note only that he bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead Poppaea, the same delicate features, the same slight build. For Nero, grieving or mad or both, this resemblance became an obsession. He would transform this boy into a replacement for his lost wife. But not through mere dressing or pretense, through surgery. In 66 or 67 A.D., Nero ordered Sporus castrated. The procedure was brutal, performed without anesthesia, involving the removal of the testicles while leaving the penis intact, the method Roman doctors called exectus testibus. The survival rate for such operations was uncertain. Infection could kill within days. But Sporus survived, and in his survival became something unique in Roman history. A slave boy surgically altered to satisfy an emperor's delusion. Nero married Sporus in a formal ceremony complete with dowry and bridal veil. The wedding was public, performed in Greece during Nero's artistic tour, attended by members of the imperial court who watched in horror, fascination, or studied neutrality. One never knew which reaction might be punished. Sporus was dressed in the stola and palla, the traditional garments of a Roman matron. He was given the title Lady and Empress. Calvea Crispinilla, a noblewoman, was appointed as his mistress of the wardrobe, a role typically reserved for empresses. The machinery of imperial administration bent itself around Nero's fantasy, accommodating the impossible because to object was to risk death. What did Sporus think? We cannot know. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio record the facts with varying degrees of moral outrage, but none thought to imagine the boy's interior life. Was he terrified? Resigned? Had his years as a slave already taught him that survival meant compliance, that resistance was futile? We know only that he played his role. He appeared at state functions as Nero's wife. He traveled with the emperor. He endured public scrutiny and private abuse. He had become a living monument to the absolute power of ownership, a boy transformed into a ghost of a dead woman. When Nero's regime collapsed in 68 A.D. and the emperor fled Rome to commit suicide, Sporus was one of only 4 companions who remained with him. Not his wife, Statilia Messalina, she stayed behind, but Sporus accompanied Nero to his death, witnessing the emperor's final moments. Then began Sporus's second nightmare, passed like property from one powerful man to another. The Praetorian prefect Nymphidius Sabinus took possession of him, continuing to dress him as a woman, continuing to call him Poppaea. When Nymphidius died attempting to seize power, Sporus fell into the hands of the emperor Otho, who had once been married to the real Poppaea before Nero forced their divorce. Whether Otho kept Sporus out of genuine affection, political calculation, or the same delusion that had driven Nero remains unclear. Otho's reign lasted only 3 months, ending with his suicide after military defeat. His successor, the Emperor Vitellius, had different plans for Sporus. He announced that Sporus would be featured in a public entertainment, a gladiatorial spectacle in which the boy would reenact the rape of Proserpina, the myth in which the god of the underworld abducts and violates a young maiden. Sporus would play Proserpina. Rape would be literal. The show would end with his death, murdered for the amusement of Roman crowds. Faced with this final degradation, Sporus chose the only form of agency available to him. He committed suicide in 69 AD, approximately 4 years after his castration, having been owned by 3 successive emperors and passed through the hands of Rome's most powerful men like currency. He was likely no older than 17 or 18. Ancient sources record his death without sentiment. Suetonius notes it as a fact. Cassius Dio mentions it in passing. Neither pauses to consider what it meant to be Sporus, to be so thoroughly objectified that your body became a stage for other people's fantasies, traumas, and perversions. They could not look away from the spectacle of imperial excess, but they could look away from the human being destroyed by it. The consequences of Rome's system of child sexual slavery rippled far beyond individual lives. Economically, the trade represented a significant sector of the empire's slave economy. Thousands of children passed through the markets annually, generating substantial revenue for dealers, auctioneers, and the state itself, which taxed slave sales. The network of procurement, transport, training, and resale created entire professions. The Mangones who specialized in this trade were wealthy men, their fortunes built on accurately predicting aristocratic tastes and maintaining supply chains that stretched from Britain to Syria. Socially, the system shaped Roman concepts of power, masculinity, and status. To own a beautiful slave boy was to demonstrate wealth, certainly, but also refinement and control. The puer delicatus served the same function as fine art or exotic animals, proof of access to rare and desirable things. Elite Romans competed to acquire the most beautiful, the most talented, the most unusual. Letters and poems reference this competition casually, treating it as unremarkable as debates over the best wine or olive oil. The normalization was so complete that even moralists who condemned sexual excess as weakness rarely questioned the right to own and exploit slave children. Their criticism focused on immoderation, not on the inherent cruelty of the practice. Psychologically, the impact on survivors was devastating and almost entirely unrecorded. Those boys who survived to adulthood faced a world with no place for them. Freedom, when granted, offered legality but not acceptance. Former pueri delicati carried stigma bodies and reputations marked by their past. Some turned to prostitution, their learned obedience reshaped for the streets. Others clung to new patrons, trading sex for protection. A few, exceptionally fortunate, found education and work as scribes or teachers. Yet all remained haunted, their childhood stolen, their worth measured in use. Pompeii offers chilling proof. Its preserved walls display graffiti and frescoes showing enslaved boys in sexual scenes, art not meant to shock, but to decorate. Found in brothels, taverns, and even respectable homes, they reveal how normalized the exploitation was. At banquets, slave boys poured wine for reclining guests, their presence unremarkable, their suffering invisible. One papyrus from Roman Egypt captures the system's cruelty in its purest form. A contract for a 10-year-old boy, described as suitable for pleasure. The language is bureaucratic, listing his physical traits like livestock height, hair color, distinguishing marks. Price noted. Seller's signature. Buyer's seal. Transaction complete. The child's name appears once, then disappears, replaced by the aforementioned slave. 2 millennia later, the document's cold precision still numbs. This wasn't exceptional. It was standard business, shielded by legality and profit. Rome's grandeur hides this paradox. A civilization that built aqueducts, codified law, and wrote philosophy also industrialized sexual slavery. Its genius coexisted with casual brutality. The question is not whether it happened, the evidence overwhelms, but how it could happen so completely, so quietly. Law reduced slaves to property. The economy rewarded exploitation. Culture sanctified dominance. A Roman man proved his power through control of slaves, of women, of conquered bodies. To use one's property freely was not shameful. It was a mark of status. A few voices objected. Seneca urged humane treatment of slaves, though he accepted slavery itself. Later, Christian writers condemned sexual exploitation, but the institution persisted, too profitable to erase, too ordinary to question. The boy, sold in 66 AD, likely lived and died unnoticed, one of thousands consumed by empire. No tomb bears his name. No poet mourned him. He vanished into Rome's machinery, a child turned commodity. The marble columns still gleam. The aqueducts still stand, but beneath their perfection lies this hidden truth: civilization built on cruelty. They could not look away from beauty. They simply never looked at him.